Welcome to this week's episode of the And Both podcast. Lori Sugarman-Li is my guest, and she is here to talk about the transition from corporate to full-time parenthood to a relaunch back into the workforce after her kids were older. And that journey has also coincided with the rise of conversations around equity at home and equity in roles. She is a fair play facilitator, and that is all come together to create a lot of the teaching and the work that she does coaching in helping families have conversations around equity and goals and collaboration and community and things like that. So it's a really wonderful conversation for a lot of reasons. I love to speak to another Canadian because there is some nuances there that I think are not necessarily always easy to pick up on. But I love when we can have people that have an experience that's different than what we typically see in America, and to be able to draw different lines culturally and societally, because even though it is just a little bit north, there is a difference in how we talk about leave and families and all of those parts. So Lori is amazing. She is out there helping people to have these conversations. She is also walking the walk, which you'll hear about in terms of raising her two boys who are 12 and 14, and how she's also coming from a deep understanding of this is what the path that she wants for herself and her families. And so without further ado, here she is. Hello and welcome to the And Both podcast. Here we are going to hear from moms and those in motherhood that are doing the thing that works for them. They are honoring themselves alongside the all-encompassing role and level of expectation that is modern motherhood. And we are going to hear from as many different people as possible in their own experience. So you can find people to relate to. You can hear stories that will make you laugh, make you cry, all of the above. And that we will come together as a community to support one another in a way that is holistic and honoring of the woman and the mother as a whole. Welcome to another episode of the And Both podcast. Today, I'm here with Lori Sugarman-Li. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited. We have a few crossed pathways on the internet and such leading up to this. So I'm excited to kind of dive into that a little bit. But first, how about if you let everybody know what you want them to know about you?
Oh my goodness. Well, I am a Canadian based now in Chicago, and I've had a few lives. My MBA is in marketing and strategy, and I worked in that field for about 15 years for Kraft Foods and Four Seasons resorts and hotels. And when I had my first baby, looking back at joining Four Seasons hotels and resorts with all of the sort of late hours and travel was a bit tricky, and they weren't offering a lot of flexibility at that time. This was 14, 15 years ago. And so I thought, you know what, let me pivot into this economy of care and see what I can do. You know, jumping in from a very sort of high level, passionate career contribution. Let me do the same in my home and my community and see how I love it. And in Canada, we have a year-long maternity leave, which is fabulous for many, many reasons, but difficult when it comes to return to work sometimes, because you really fall into that new career, that new family career. And I actually found I really was thriving in it. And we were fortunate in that we were able to be a one-income family and knew that my husband was going to be having some opportunities to relocate. And we thought, okay, let me dive in on this, focus on this, and see what I can do. And I really went all in, you know, president of the Parents Association, charitable boards, all sorts of community involvement. And I felt so nourished in the work. And I saw, and I think the people that I was working directly with saw the value in it. Fast forward, we relocated to London for 4 years. I really took the same approach to involvement and contribution. And then we moved to the US to Chicago, and we moved here. We didn't have any connections, no safety net, no family, not even any friends yet. And so my husband, Kevin, said to me, look, let's get all of our documents in order. We'll get you insurance, obviously health insurance, life insurance, but let's get you disability insurance, because if anything, God forbid, happens to you, he said, I would have to leave work and head up the family. That was how much we valued the role. So we filled in all the forms and did all the health exams and everything you have to do for insurance, only for the agent to say to me, you're just a housewife.
Oh,
And if something happens to you, there's no salary lost. And I was rejected. And it was such a fireball moment for me to recognize that beyond my little bubble, there was this like systemic devaluing of this work that I had been so devoted to for, at that time, 10 years. And I sort of took a minute to be on fire. And immediately I knew I had to be a part of the solution to that issue, which was that not only is there a lack of visibility of this unpaid work, the work of the home, the work of community, right? But there is no value attached to it by our society. This insurance agent is one demonstration of that. Our GDP not counting it is another, right? And I started writing and reading and connecting. And the first thing I said was, if I want this to be perceived as work and as valuable, I need to start talking about it that way. The first thing I did was set up a LinkedIn profile for myself. And it was such a fascinating process to begin to articulate, right, in a way that belongs on a resume, all of these achievements that I had had in this unpaid role, all of these contributions that I had made. And I started to think, wow, there is so much here. And I was found on LinkedIn by a woman doing similar work. She invited me onto her podcast. And I had that moment of like, me on a podcast? Like what? Like I'm just a stay-at-home mom right now, right? And I was like, no, we're not thinking about it like that anymore. And so began my involvement in these conversations. And it led to me finding Eve Rodsky, who wrote the book Fair Play, which is really all about visibility, value, and equity in unpaid labor. And I got really involved with Eve as a mentor. And I studied actually to be a fair play facilitator and family coach to help guide other families through this sort of sticky transition to value. And I really wanted to go beyond that with a major contribution to break cycles for the next generation so that we don't have to prove this value anymore. And so I thought, well, what can I do given my platform and my credibility? And I decided to write a children's book to speak to the next generation about the beautiful work of home and care and the fact that there is a place for our whole family in it and not just mom, and really try to build value in unpaid labor from the ground up.
I love that. You know, what I was thinking is that when you were talking about the disability insurance, I've heard and have been told this when we were in the journey of like life insurance, and you know, I was pregnant with our first baby and all of this, is that that having more life insurance for women versus men, because if I died and I had kids, then there'd have to be someone who would provide childcare and all this stuff.
Yes.
It's like, so if you are injured or you become ill and you require someone to take over, it's like this element of like, can't you just suck it up a little bit and like do this? But if you flat out die, then it's like, oh, well, I guess now we should probably get the calculator out and figure out how many different services we need to pull in.
Exactly. All the different roles that she was playing and how much it would cost to replace all that, right?
Yeah.
And when you find, there have been a lot of articles lately written about that, right? Like what is the cost or the value to replace a mother? And the interesting thing is, you know, they they list all of the things that are typically given to a mother's plate, right? So if you had to have a cook, if you had to have a driver, if you had to have a tutor, if you had to have all these things. But in most of these calculations, they measure the work at minimum wage, right? Which is still sort of like a misrepresentation of the contribution that it makes. And I have actually a stat here. Women globally do $10.8 trillion of unpaid labor every year. That's one that was measured at minimum wage. So imagine if we were actually given our flowers for all these contributions. You're not hiring a cook at minimum wage, right? To make 3 meals a day for your family and do all the food procurement and everything associated. And the mental labor of remembering what everybody loves and what everybody needs and who has allergies and whatnot.
Yeah. And that's like another, it's sort of like the attempted olive branch in all of this equality piece. It's like, okay, well, we hear you complain. Let's just cram a number together. But there's still a fundamental deficit or divide between what people really value as work and what people don't. Because if that person was a chef, they wouldn't get paid minimum wage
Exactly
to feed their own family.
Exactly.
It boggles my mind. It still boggles my mind that we still keep circling back on so many elements of this. And even when we do try and attach a dollar amount to it, it's still not where it needs to be. But we're supposed to be happy that the conversation is happening.
And I think, what you just said sparked something for me, which is like, why does everything have to have a dollar value to have an inherent value, right? Like for me, when I was doing this work for a decade and not getting paid, the value was in so many other elements, right? There was no money associated with it, right? And if you think about like kids who get an allowance to do quote unquote chores, right? The only value to them in that transaction is the money that they receive after. And so I want to talk to families about the inherent value of these contributions, the way that it impacts children's management and organizational skills, the way we connect as a family when we do it together, right? I remember being young. I did so much around the house when I was young, but again, not surprising to hear as the inequity in the home is measured in girls as young as 8, right? So, I saw that my mother was doing it and I became involved. I also had a dad who really thrived when he had a partner in a lot of his tasks. And so that was a role that I played. But it led to my dad and I having so much time together, and me understanding so much about what it took to run the home. Because one of the things that I did with my dad was help him organize his bills and his household management papers. And so there's so much more than just like, oh, I made my bed, give me $5, right? If we really talk to our kids about the contribution that this makes to the wellness of family, that's the first step to value.
Yeah. And also, if you write out a chore list for your son and your daughter, switch them. If you really want to see if you're what decade you fall into, right?
Love that.
Because how many daughters get handed lawn mowing?
Yeah.
And how many sons get handed the dishwasher?
Right. Or anything to do with the car or anything to do, right? Yeah, no, I know. And that's another thing, my dad had 2 daughters. So when I turned 16, he gave me a toolbox. And he's like, you're going to need this when you go to university. We're going to put together your IKEA furniture. He taught me how to do it. And so I guess he was a little ahead of his time, which upon reflection has served me well. But I just think, listen, and in fairness to families, let's take a step back. We are rushing through every day trying to get it all done. And the pressure on families to like thrive and excel is greater than ever, right? There's an interesting statistic that mothers who work outside the home today spend more hours engaging with their children than stay-at-home mothers did in the 60s.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is number one, because we love our children and we want to be closely connected with them, but also because there is a societal expectation that women are here to absorb and serve, to their families. And it's coming at the expense of women's health, right? And so it's a balance that we have to find where the work of home and family gets done and is valued, but also doesn't take over and drown us.
Yeah. I think I agree wholeheartedly. Like I think the societal pressure and expectation that we're raised in, you can look at it sort of after you go through that and as you start to build and grow your own family and say, I don't want this to be like this. I don't want this to be like this. And then what happens is, you're right, you get to that tipping point where all of a sudden, like, the calendar is packed and this is this and this is this. And what happens? The first thing that happens,
Yeah.
mom says, oh, I can handle that. And
Yep.
then there's no going back.
That's right.
Because as soon as you reach that pinch point, as much as you are striving and pushing and wanting it to have more equity and wanting it to have more of a spread that is a different experience than what we grow up in, as soon as that pressure is applied, we all fall back on the conditioning that we have.
And it's amazing how that calendar gets filled without sort of a family reflection on what's really important to us, for the year ahead or for the month ahead or between now and the holidays or whatever it is. What are our values, which is always where I start with families. And as I've heard you speak about before, what are our goals, right? And then you populate the calendar with things that align to that, not with things that you think are expected of you or that your neighbors are doing or that you have to keep up with, but fill that calendar with things that truly align to your goals and values as a family. And it doesn't matter what anybody else's goals and values are. And that's the beautiful thing about this little unit that we live in, right? It's so fascinating, right? I have 2 kids. A lot of families these days have more. You are like a little team that moves through life, like together or in tandem. And it's really all about like knowing what everybody else is up to, knowing what everybody else needs and how we can support each other through it. And we all have to be all hands on deck to make it work. And if it's stuck, then we need to sort of stop and take a breath and reflect on what the sticking points are.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that the idea of fair play and these kind of programs or models that start this conversation and say, hey, someone reaches a point where they're like, this is not working. And instead of this just sort of floating along, because it's easy to have it float along for everybody but that one person.
That's it.
And then to have these conversations and say, okay, here's where my priorities are and here's where yours are. And how do we layer this all together? It's the beginning of those conversations is why I started my company.
Right. Exactly.
And it's that idea of like, how do we want a different way forward, but we need to have the tools in order for the way forward to be possible, because everything is set up so that mom manages the calendar.
And I think if tools like yours are to be used to their highest potential, a family has to be grounded in the importance and the value of this work at its foundation, right? Because once we leave the house, we're sort of like at the mercy of the rest of the world and the crazy sort of societal expectations. But in our own home, we can sit around the table or we can sit underneath a blanket. We can, get like a bag of gummy bears or whatever it is and just take a minute and say, are we doing the things that bring us joy, that satisfy our goals, that don't stress us out too much? Are we all pitching in alignment to the way that we're wired, to the way that we can have success with, right? And it gives you this opportunity as a family to say, actually, this thing that we're doing, that's not important to me. Or I saw at my friend's house that they do this thing, like, do we need to be doing that? Or just, I'm feeling overwhelmed. Or the tasks that are assigned to me, like, I don't feel success with those, or I don't get the dopamine hit when I finish that, or whatever the language is, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a way that you can sort of like shift the puzzle pieces around to say, okay, we can do better. We can do it differently. Like, let's try this. And even when you put everything on this beautiful calendar, it can still be changed. It's
Right.
organic.
Right. And also too, like focusing on that piece, because I think that there's an important element of that conversation for kids as they grow up. Because what happens is if you grow up like that, where everything is just sort of funneled from one thing to the next, one thing to the next, and you're doing to do and you're doing to get through. When you hit later teenage years and you start going out into college and the world and working and all of that stuff, there's a fundamental disconnect between what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Correct. And if you even know how to do it at that stage of life, right? And that's why my book here that I've written is, to me, so foundational for families, because it involves children in the language, the energy, and the why of all of this stuff that we do around the house from a young age, so that they feel a part of it. They feel empowered to participate. They understand it, right? And they can tackle parts of it as partners, as contributors. And then when they go off to university, guess what? They have like a full arsenal of knowledge and skills. They know they have to change their sheets, which is really important if you want to invite somebody over, right? You want to have clean sheets. And so talking about the importance of these little tasks that really elevate our wellness, the younger you start to talk about it and talk about it in a way that like showcases its inherent importance, the more success your kids will have, even at that point, but later on as well.
Yeah. I have kind of not weird, but an interesting sliding doors, I guess, experience around this. So I went to undergrad in Canada and I went to grad school in the US.
Right.
And it is a really interesting space because when I went to school in Canada, I got dropped off in Nova Scotia. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know where I was, and any of that, right?
Yes.
But everyone else, you're 18 years old. Everyone else, your parents show up and they help you move your stuff in, or whoever brings you to school, they help you move your stuff in, and you go and you have lunch and everyone cries and then they leave and you go on with your life.
Right.
Right. You go on with your life. You figure out where your classes are. You do all of that. You figure out where the grocery store is and you open a bank account and you get your health insurance card because it's free. And I mean, small plug there, but
plug for Canada.
But you go about your life and there's not this, like, no one holds your hand. Like if you don't do what you need to do, you don't carry on in school. And no one's feeling bad for you if you can't figure out how to get yourself to class on time. So that's my experience there, right? Is like, we're all doing this. It's kind of hard, yada, yada. And then I went to grad school and I worked in the Academic Resource Center. And there was one woman that she was one of the people that helped with IEP kind of accommodations and things like that. And this woman literally sat in her office for hours and hours on end, answering the phone for incoming kids, telling their parents who were calling that their kids were 18. And if their kids wanted accommodations in university, they were adults and she was not able.
That's fascinating.
It was
great.
Yeah. So these people these parents were coming in and they were like, these kids weren't even like moving themselves into school. Like these kids were coming and their parents were like, they're coming in and they're making their bed and they are taking them to the bookstore and all of that. I mean, it could also be total like transparency. It could also be that I was like, the car slowed to a slow roll and I got booted out with all my stuff and it was like, good luck.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that was, and also like, I don't know if you're Gen X, but that was just like the Gen X experience too, right? In general. Yeah.
Yeah. Forget. I don't even know where I'm 40. So I think I fall somewhere in
Oh,
the
you're
middle of
millennial.
like,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, like figure it out, no internet, everything's backward. Like I'm in the fray of that.
Figure it out.
Yeah, to figure it out. But this I was utterly fascinated by the amount of accompaniment that people were getting from their family, not because it was like, I'm going to run all this over and I'm going to make sure that everything's fine. These kids didn't know how to do this.
Yeah. That's it.
But they weren't like, I don't know how to do this and I'm going to figure it out. They were like, I don't know how to do this, so I'm just not.
Right. And so maybe the parents had a revelation in the moment, which was like, oh goodness, we really should have prepared you more for this. Or maybe they just jumped in like they always do and fixed it and continue to fix it. And that's not sustainable, but it's also not ideal for the child.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you work so hard, I think a lot of times I hear parents say, with little children, let them be kids, let them be little, let them play, right? But what are they playing with? They have a plastic kitchen, they have a plastic baby and a plastic baby carriage. They want to do these like beautiful, nurturing things that they see us doing. So instead of like playing at the plastic kitchen, come on into the kitchen and, we will safely and age appropriately begin to expose you to, the language and processes of food. And yes, for parents, things sometimes take longer that way or are messier that way. It's true at the beginning, but these kids learn so quickly and passionately, and they love being a part of important things. And I used to work for a food company, Kraft, and we did a ton of research on kids and food. And I can tell you that when children are involved in the procurement and preparation of food, they're more likely to try new things, right? And expand what they're willing to engage in, right? Food wise. And so the little kids, but then, teenagers, I think, were often so protective of their time with their academics, right? Because there's so much pressure to get into a good college or their time devoted to their athletics or whatever their extracurriculars are. And we really allow them the space to just focus on what's going to be that direct line to college. Well, guess what? When they get into a great school, if they don't know how to feed themselves nourishing meals, no matter how hard they study, they're not going to do as well as they could do on that exam. Right? Because it's all about a holistic wellness. And the earlier we can prepare kids with a lot of these skills and empower them, right, to participate and own things, by the time they're in college, it's going to be second nature. They won't even think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always said, so before I went to OT school, I shadowed with an OT, and she had this idea. So one of the things that she worked with was kids around like sensory issues with food. And she used a pool as her modality for this. So like the kids would splash around in the pool and they would play and they would work on like textures and introducing textures and things like that, which sounds very strange because food and water, but it worked. It was unbelievable.
Interesting.
And I remember her saying something to the effect of like, if in all things considered, kids are going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, right? They don't want to stop to eat. That's why like, they're on to the next activity and all this stuff. And so she would say, like, when they're in the water, like they can't get away, not in a like, haha, I've got you now, but like they can't get away. They want to play and they're able to play and do the eating piece at the same time. And they're more likely to try something because they're not running around trying to, they're not going to be in a clinic setting and have a plate at the table and they're running around the classroom because that's what they're doing at home. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. And so I remember when my kids were little and it was the same thing, right? Like nobody wants to stop and eat unless it's like fruit snacks or whatever. And I would sit the kids on the counter. My kids will eat anything on the counter. And that's part of it, right? Is like they're up there while you're like cutting vegetables and they're up there, all this. So like if my kids are having a hard time with, there's stuff going on, they'll sit on the counter and like eat a sandwich because they can watch everything that's going on around.
Right.
But it's stuff like that it's just, it's fascinating. And I also love that you work for Kraft Food because it's like one of the top 5 Canadian companies. Like if someone was like a Canadian corporate company, I'd be like Kraft for sure is on the list.
It was a fabulous place for my formative, marketing and strategy education, which has really been such a part of what I'm doing now, because what I realized early on is that, things like societally prescribed domestic roles and terms like stay at home mom, like it's all about rebranding it, right? It's really a marketing exercise because what we fundamentally believe about this, like, needs to be unlearned, right? And reframed. Even this word chore, right? It's such an unfortunate label for this work that we do. It's immediately when I say chore, like, what do you think of?
Right. It's like going to work in a mine. I'd
Right.
rather.
It's a downer. It's a heavy word, tedious, unappealing, like whatever relates to it, right? And I think, well, if I was a kid and I was given a list of chores, I'd probably have the exact same reaction, right? But there's an opportunity to see this work for what it really is, which is an expression of gratitude for all that we have and for those with whom we share it. And if we can remind ourselves, right, by changing the way that we speak about the work of home and family and its connection to wellness and its connection to bonding and its connection to thriving, get rid of this word chore. It doesn't apply. This is the work of being grateful for the beautiful clothes we have that need to be cleaned, for the beautiful meal that we ate from which the dishes are dirty, right? And whatever it is. And I think, again, getting back to this rushing through life all the time, the opportunity is to just stop and say, you know what? We have so much to be thankful for. And yes, we have to look after it. Yes, we have to put gas in our car, change the oil, put the snow tires on, whatever, depending on where you live. It takes time. It takes effort. Often we have to pay for it. We may have to take time off of our paid work to do it, but we have a car. How lucky are we? Right? And I use this sort of why behind the work a lot when I talk to parents about engaging kids. It's so much more than just a list of things that we have to get done. There's meaning behind all of it. There are reasons, right? And so we change our sheets every Monday. Okay. So if I were to say to my 14-year-old, oh yeah, today is the day you have to strip your bed and put the new sheets on. Now that's annoying, right? But if I sit him down and say, hey, I just want you to know why we do this. This is what's on your body. This is how the body transfers it onto your sheets. And if you're not sleeping on a clean pillowcase and clean sheets, it can really impact the health of your skin. As a 14-year-old boy, he suddenly perks up, right? He's like, wait, my skin? And I'm like, yeah, if you always have a clean pillowcase, it's really going to facilitate the cleanliness and the clarity of your skin. And so that's why we change our bed. He's like, oh, I'm in. I get it. And I get why the benefit comes directly to me. And so why I need to be involved. Getting back to the car, another example that I love to use, especially with little kids, that you're maybe carpooling around a lot. And so you have your own kids and your friends' kids and car seats that a lot of stuff gets crammed in behind or underneath or whatever. And there's Cheerios on the floor and a banana peel and a granola bar wrapper and all this stuff. You can sort of be annoyed that the car is messy, right? Or that the kids are just dropping things without thinking. Or you can explain to your kids, even little kids, right? How cars hold value, right? And what the life of a car is and what it means to the life of the car if you take care of it versus if you don't. And if you have a car that you lease or that you've bought that you maybe are going to sell, if you can think ahead to those 2 years from now when you're going to sell it, the impact to your family of looking after it and what the value of it will be in 2 years versus if you continue to drop the Cheerios and the granola bars and the banana peels on the floor, then you can say to kids, like, we might actually get, I don't know, $500 more for this car if we look after it. If we do, let's dream about what we would do with $500 in our family, right? Make them a part of the process of care and the
Yeah.
beneficiaries of it.
Yeah, I like we change our sheets on Sundays because it's like, Sunday morning, get ready for the week.
That's a
And I
great day
think,
for it.
yeah, it's a love, because I'm like, who, like, you go to bed on Sunday night, you're ready for the week, everything is like, I mean, and I have yet to encounter a weekend where all of my kids are like, yes, I have dreamed about changing the sheets. This is my favorite thing ever. But after we talk about, I mean, not all the time, but after it commonly comes up about, like, why do we have to do this again? And I'm like, well, because don't you, like, when your room looks like a snow globe that got shaken,
Yeah.
it does not feel like a place you want to be in. It doesn't feel like a place you want to play because things are kind of everywhere. When you pick up your room and you get yourself ready for the week, then does it feel more calm? Does it feel cozier? Does it feel like a space you want to be in? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
stick
And
with me.
you raised a really good point there, a really interesting point, which is that not everybody has the same standard
Yeah.
for what makes their environment feel good to them, right?
Mhm.
I'll give you an example. I have my 14-year-old. He's my 14-year-old's getting a lot of airtime today. So I am pretty type A. I like things put away, tucked in, organized, lined up. That's my comfort zone. He doesn't feel that way.
Mhm.
He really thrives in an environment where stuff is out. He likes to see the things that are important to him. He's very nostalgic. He loves reminders of good times that he's had, of places that he's been. And so all of his surfaces are really covered with stuff. And so when I finally sort of realized my standard is not meaningful for him, what's meaningful is to help him understand how to set his own standards to be his best self for his best space. And so instead of me going in and saying, no, like this has to be put away, like everything on this dresser needs to be put in the drawer. But that's not the right thing for him. The right thing for him is for me to sit with him and say, what do you love about your space? What's important to you about your space? And how can we make your space the best that it can be so that you feel safe and comfortable, and you are able to tap into your nostalgia and all the things that are important to you, but it's not covered in dust and there's no crumbs and there's no, anything that's going to compromise the sort of health of the space, which is really what my standard is.
Yeah.
So that's what we're working on.
Yeah. And two, I mean, to pull in kind of what we were talking about earlier with this idea about, like, doing the things that we're doing for the sake of my neighbors doing that or my friends doing that, and I need to do that. I think that is where a lot of the rub comes, because you have these houses that, or, on any sort of social media feed that's like, this is the ideal setting, right? Like, the ideal setting is everything looks showroom ready, everything looks hotel ready.
Exactly.
And that may be the thing that works, like, for you, but also giving kids a chance to figure out where their point is again helping them prepare down the line. Like,
Yeah.
when I lived by myself, when I was in university, I realized that, like, I grew up in a house that had a fridge that had 3 open ketchups and, like, all these jam things, whatever. And it's like, you open the fridge and you're like, oh gosh, like, I don't want to eat anything in here. But in my own fridge, when I was in control of, like, the things that went in there, it's like, oh, I can easily find these pieces. So this is important. So now I'm the fridge cleaner outer in my family because nobody else cares about that stuff.
So, two things that you just said that are such great points that I want to touch on. When you were talking about kids, what's so important, right? What you said is giving them a voice to express like their needs, their wants, their desires, like their happy space. And that's why I love to encourage families to start with sort of this family meeting and connection. And as you always talk about with goals and values. So the ability for people to express what their sort of standards are is so important. And then connected to that, which you also just raised, is like reflecting on your own raising. And this is so important when people come together in couple, because chances are they were raised in different types of households with different standards, with different processes. Maybe they have cultural differences, or maybe they came from like different family constructions, right? Like maybe one had like one parent, maybe one had two, or maybe one had like a grandparent living in the house, or whatever it is. And I think so often families don't unpack that together, and they don't really sit down and think, why is this my standard? Like, why do I care about doing it this way? And I want to hear what you care about, so that together as a family, we can either meet in the middle, or we can agree on mine or on yours, because we really understand why. And so these opportunities to talk, and again, that's what I'm so hoping my book is going to do, is be a spark for these types of conversations about what we do to make our home flow and thrive. It's such an important investment of time for families. I mean, if you are raised by a mother who, really did it all. So if a husband was raised by a mother who really did it all, and a wife in this particular partnership is coming in looking for like, equity, there's going to have to be some conversations there to like understand, oh yeah, my parents actually didn't do that. I don't have a model for that.
Yeah.
So that's when systems are really, really important, right? Because they become like the life vest for families who didn't have that model growing up. Things are changing.
And you also need to have openness around a different way, right? Because like if you have one
Exactly.
person that's saying, well, this is how I was raised and this is what I firmly believe in, and I am not willing to compromise, then you're in a whole different bracket than this is not how I was raised. However,
Yeah. Then
I
you
can
need
see
more
where
than
you're
a
coming from.
calendar.
Yeah. Yes. You need some, that's a longer than a one couch conversation.
Correct.
In terms of finding us mutual ground. So how old are your kids?
They're 12 and 14.
12 and 14.
Yes.
And so you are navigating that transition out towards more independence.
Right. Like I can see it on the horizon.
Yeah.
And so there's a few things that I do now. I mean, when I do this work around the house, I do it much more loudly than I used to. I think when I first became a parent, because I was coming from a professional existence where I had a very high standard of performance for myself, I shifted into that expectation for my home life. And as you just said, my home was like showroom ready. And I did it all when my husband was at work and when my kids were asleep. And so it was like a fairy came in and did it all. Nobody ever saw it. Nobody ever saw the process. Nobody ever understood what it really took to get it all done. And even though, I mean, I'm sure my husband came home and was like, looks great in here. He really did not understand like the complexity of the executional work, and also the mental preparation and all the cognitive labor that goes into teeing that up. Right. And so I realized that nobody was benefiting from that, even though all my work to make it perfect, like felt so important. Nobody was learning anything. And I was on this hamster wheel of doing that day after day, and my house looked perfect, but who cares? Because nobody was learning anything. We never talked about it. And so now I realize the opportunity is for me to do everything in front of them, so that not only do they see how much effort goes into all of it, but they see the process. And so often when I'm in the laundry room, I have two soccer players, so we have a lot of dirty uniforms. when I'm in the laundry room, I will actually stop myself before I get started on spraying everything and doing whatever. And I'll call my younger son in and I'll say, I want you to see how I'm doing this. You see all this mud, you see the grass stain. I want to show you what I do. So, and then I'll even give him the spray right here. See what happens. I'll tell him what it is. This starts eating away at the grass, whatever. And then we have to turn it inside out because it's better for like the decals and the numbers if your shirt is inside out. So when it's splashing around the washing machine, it doesn't peel off or whatever. And then, for the things that go in the dryer, I remember the first time I showed him the lint catch, he was fascinated. And so I realized the opportunity is they need to see all the little bits. And guess what? Now my 12-year-old folds all the laundry in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows now what the process is. So I do all the washing and, we hang most of our stuff, whatever. And then when it's dry, it sits on top of the dryer. He grabs it, takes it into his room, sorts it by family member. He will do everybody's except his brothers. His brothers he leaves on his brother's bed, which is totally great. But, it's because he saw me doing it. And also because he sees, oh, it's not that hard actually.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not that big of a deal. And he started folding little cleaning rags, or little square towels, right? And he graduated from there. And the benefit to that is not only that he contributes to the effort, but in putting away all his own laundry, he knows where everything is.
Yeah.
And so when he gets dressed in the morning, he knows exactly what he wants to wear and where it is. It's the same thing now with groceries. So whether or not I go to the store, I'll usually take one of them. Or if I order, I will have them unpack the delivered groceries and put the stuff away in the fridge and in the pantry. And guess what? Nobody asks me anymore. What is there to eat?
Oh,
because they know.
Question.
Because they know. They unpacked it. They organized the pantry. We did a huge pantry reorg before school started. They know exactly what's in there. So they get home from school before they go to soccer. They know what they need to be nourished. They grab it. Now they're at a stage where they can like warm stuff up. It's so great. It's so great to see them thriving in their independence. And also for me to be able to take a bit of a step back, which, like, let's be honest, as parents is not easy. As mothers, particularly, it's not easy because so much of our esteem is connected to our support of them, right?
Yeah.
And so recognizing though that this is what's better for them is so important.
Well, and also too, shifting the mindset from support of them does not mean doing for them anymore. And how that you've got to transition from 100% doing to 0% doing. And you're going to get into that weird time in between. But the fact that they're doing it for themselves is just as vital in the checking of box than as you doing it for them. Because
and
now it's
so
something
funny,
that's
and it's so funny to see how proud they are. They're not annoyed by the weight of the task. They're empowered and they feel really grown up.
Yeah. And too, also like when you say, when they realize it's not that hard, I think that's the thing that sometimes people latch onto is like, well, it's not that hard to fold the laundry. And you're like, you know what? It isn't that hard to fold the laundry, but it is hard
all of it for 30
get
years.
you get all the clothes and you run through the cycles and you're keeping track of that and all of that. So like, yes, it is not hard to fold laundry. No one is trying to. I don't think anyone in the equity conversation is trying to convince the world that like we are doing something that is not doable. I feel like that's the crux of so much of this is we are doing something that is easily doable and yet it's still falling on our lap. Because and we're not asking people to like, I don't want you to reprogram the space station. I just want you to fold your own underwear.
That's right. And because you see the value in the task and because you recognize that the weight of all of that should not sit on me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that, it is that idea of like, it is simple to care for myself. Like as you move through the teenage years, it is simple to care for myself when it comes to all of these pieces, but also recognizing that in the folding of the laundry and in the putting away of the groceries, I am not, if there's 6 steps to this, I am participating in 1 step. But you don't understand, if you don't ever see any of the steps, how simple it is to do the last one.
That, yeah, when my kids do take ownership on a task and complete it however they do, right? Sometimes it's like fantastic and sometimes it's like a little bit stumbly. Doesn't matter. The
Mhm.
importance is in the engagement and the effort. I will often let them know what I was able to do with that half an hour because I wasn't unloading and putting away the groceries. I want to show you what I was able to do. Oh, I, finished this article that I was writing. That's so important to me that I had the time to do that. Or, I got to take a shower finally today. So thank you so much. Like,
Mhm.
because you jumped in, it was meaningful for me as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes that really resonates with them.
Yeah, because I do think, like, we, everybody wants to be helpful, and what happens is that you end up in this space of like, it's easier for me to do it because I have a system. The system is like carrying boulders uphill.
Okay.
However, it's the system that I have, and then there you can not miss, but the window, the gray area where you can start to recruit people in to take on their own tasks becomes harder and harder to break into. And so then you end up by default teaching a pattern of, I'll do it myself, when
Correct.
really, you're not going to get to. It's harder if someone is 17 years old to teach them how to do their laundry. That's not to say if they're learning how to do their laundry at 17 that you've missed the boat. What
Never
what
too
I'm
late.
s- Yeah, what I'm saying is, like, when they're 5 and putting away their pants that are folded for them, there's a way to move. In therapy we call it chaining. So you can have backwards
That's right.
chaining and forwards chaining.
That's right.
And so if you chain the activity for them, to you do steps 1 through 5 and then they do 6, then eventually you do steps 1 through 4 and then they do 5 and 6, and as you peel off in that way, they become, eventually the task becomes completely, all 6 steps are theirs.
Yeah, I love that visual. That's really impactful.
Mhm. And I think too, like, that's what people want. Like, if you want someone to take on ownership of their own thing, no one's going to take on ownership if they've got to go down to, like, the McAllister's basement with the washer and dryer and the big scary furnace, and all of a sudden there you are, you're like dropped into it, right? Like,
Right.
if there is success along the way based on age appropriate levels of
Yep.
responsibility taking, you're setting yourself up for so much more ease in the transition piece.
100%. And, and breaking these cycles where we sort of insulate kids from any involvement in this stuff for so many reasons, right? Because women take on this notion that we have to completely, because of, wanting to let kids just be little, as we talked about before, because we were raised this way to be perfect contributors, whatever. There's a lot for us as women to unlearn in this process as well. And, not to add stuff to the mental load of motherhood and being a woman in society, which is already like as long as your leg, a list as long as your leg. Like, we do have to recognize that there is an opportunity for us to step back a little bit,
Mhm.
and that in this chaining journey, right? The passing of the torch, like, it's not always going to look perfect. We will stumble a little bit, and it's okay as long as we give ourselves the opportunity with like a weekly family meeting or whatever it is to reconnect on it and reflect on it and say, well, how could we do this a bit differently next time? How did this feel? How did this look for us? And how could we do it a little bit differently next time? And the points of connection are what really bolster the system, any system that you have in place.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Like, if there's no acknowledgement, if there's only one-sided acknowledgement, then that leads to all sorts of trouble that nobody wants, right? You lead to assumptions and resentment and burnout and overwhelm and all of these
All of
pieces.
it.
So it's this idea of coming together and truly collaborating by having community. Like you were saying earlier, like your home is your little community, your little nest.
Yeah.
And how do you make that feel as comfortable as possible for all people that participate in the nest? Some people that means like a very aesthetic approach, and some people that means I have clean sheets, the rest of my room looks like a tornado, but I know where everything is,
Yeah.
and this is what feels safe, and how all that can layer together.
Yeah. Exactly. What works for your family is all that matters. But what's important is that you come together to decide what that is and communicate together on what that is. And a lot of the resentment and stress builds up right when standards are different or expectations are different. And so many couples don't even talk about division of labor, because they can't anticipate that it's going to be a complication in their relationship. And so a lot of what I do in my coaching is kind of like help couples and families reset foundationally because they've never had these conversations. They've been living together for like a decade, right? Or however many years it is. They've never talked about any of this. They're just rushing through every day wearing the societal hats that they think they're supposed to wear, all feeling sort of all these things that you just said, like exhaustion, resentment, stress, whatever, because they've never sat down and really unpacked like, oh, it takes a lot to keep this family and house going.
Yeah.
And we actually really should discuss like how we're going to tackle that. Get rid of things that aren't important to us that we're carrying. You said a boulder up. I think you said a really great analogy. A boulder.
Oh yeah, carrying the boulder up the hill.
Boulder up the hill. Like if that's not a beautiful boulder to you, get rid of it. Like imagine if I said to my kids, "Case on the weekends, we don't make our beds. We just don't have to. We don't care. Like we do it as a part of our school day to get ourselves going because there is actually research to show that when you make your bed, it kind of like sets you up for like a high executive functioning day. On the weekends, let's not make our beds. Okay. For some family, that's like a relief, right? Anything you can take off the list that doesn't add value to how you feel about your family unit and your home as an organization, unless it's like a community standard, like the day that you have to put out your garbage or whatever it is.
Right.
Right. Make your own rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love it. So how do people connect with you? Because you do coach. So how does that tell everyone all about the work that you do there?
So I say that I'm like WD-40 for families. And when they're feeling uncomfortable in their flow and they're feeling stuck, when they're feeling resentment, when they're feeling inequity, right? When they're really in desperate need of the systems, right? And the tools that like you and I are so focused on providing, I help them reset. And I help them with language, which a lot of families find helpful, right? Like new ways of expressing and communicating about the way that their family flows and what's important and what's not and how they thrive and how they're wired, right? Like it's such a great opportunity for someone to say, oh, actually that's not how I'm comfortable. Like I understand you need the kitchen to be this way, but that's not how I'm comfortable. Families aren't having those conversations. So I facilitate a lot of those and help them with systems like fair play, which is like a structure for the family to find their way to a more equitable division of labor. And then with my children's book enables me to bridge those conversations and those systems to kids, which is really, really nice. And then finally, a lot of what I help families with, in particular women, is really understanding how to set boundaries around their wellness so that they don't find themselves completely drowning in this work and their sort of like inability to sort of emerge and find what brings them joy, what enables them to have the rest that they need, and the connections to, friends and family and whatnot. So you can find me on my website, which is Our Home, Our Pride, reach out if you're interested in some kind of coaching and connection work. And then my book is available anywhere books are sold, which
I love
has
it.
been a really fabulous experience. And I'm really proud to have made the contribution to family conversations.
And too, like you're doing it in a way that is a different level of accessibility. So it's not, again, the responsibility is not on mom to buy the book about equity and read the book about equity and then facilitate the conversation about equity. It is, how do we have this conversation at a different point where other people can get involved? And it can be at different levels of where the family's at right now, age and stage.
Exactly. That's what I was hoping to do, was to take this like desperate desire for equity, but not knowing how to get there. Like, how do I get my kids involved in chores? How do I, stop my husband from like always needing a list? Like how? I think what I was hoping the book would do would be to spark those conversations and take the pressure off of typically the mother who's the feeler of all of this strain, and the book to step in and kind of do it for the family.
I love it. Well, I'll put all of the links and links to buy the book and all of that up on the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's been great. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me inside the And Both podcast this week. If you like what you heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. Leaving a rating and/or a review helps us reach more listeners in their And Both journey. For more updates, visit andbothpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram at andbothpodcast, LinkedIn at andbothpodcast, and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. You can also connect directly with guests and other listeners inside the And Both community. Go to andbothpodcast.com for more information, and thank you again for joining us.